Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, collègues, mes amis. C'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je vous souhaite la bienvenue au Centre des études en politique internationale et à l'Université d'Ottawa. Je m'appelle Rita Paramsi et je suis la directrice du CEPI. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. Today's roundtable, Making Liberal Internationalism Great Again, What Role for Middle Powers in the Illiberal World, follows a two-day workshop hosted by the Social Science Research Council, Social Science and Humanities Research Council. So what we did, we brought together scholars from the University of Ottawa in Canada and from two of the leading Scandinavian centres for international politics. The Danish Institute of International Studies, DIS, in Copenhagen, and the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, in Oslo. And for that reason, this roundtable is to be followed by a reception hosted by the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Ottawa. So, in honor of our Scandinavian guests and Ambassador Orban, let me say a few words in Norwegian. Hjertelig velkommen til SIPS og til Ottawa. Det har vært kjempehyggelig å ha dere her alle sammen. Jeg skulle ønske dere kunne bli her litt lenger, men jeg håper at dette er begynnelsen på et veldig langt, fruktbart og interessant samarbeid. Så tusen takk og hjertelig velkommen. Sometimes as a scholar, you have a kind of historic moment when you're really lucky. You hit upon a research topic and all of a sudden it becomes hot. Everyone is interested in it, and it's in the news every day, and it just gets more and more interesting. Other times, I think you're just plain historically unlucky. You're interested in something, but nobody else is. And then something changes in the world, and what you were interested in is just getting more and more like yesterday's news, and nobody's interested. I think in this case, there is no doubt that we've been historically lucky in the sense that the issues of international liberalism, threats to the international liberal order, is certainly becoming more and more interesting, hotter and hotter, so to speak, every day. And, every day you listen to the news, there's something else that seems to be an emerging threat or something that is changing in the international order, institutions, the recent developments in Italy and Hungary, just as we speak, is just the latest example of this. At the same time, it's kind of hard to say that we're plain historically lucky, because with best will in the world, these are not exactly positive developments. So, historically lucky, but historically unlucky in other ways. When we planned this workshop, and in that sense, I think having this conversation now is very useful, because when we planned this workshop and the roundtable, it was very clear to us that we didn't want quite simply to engage in a love fest of liberal internationalism. We didn't want some kind of nostalgia looking back for some lost, lovely period that existed. And we didn't want simply to engage in some kind of uncritical celebration of something called Canadian values and the Nordic model. We wanted to say, yeah, those things are probably there, they're probably good, but there is something to this critique of liberal internationalism that we need to take seriously and that we need to engage with. How do we engage with it? And how then, having realized that there is something important in the critique, some of the critiques at least, of liberal internationalism, how do we still hang on to the hope that there is something we can do to make the world a better place? And that, I think, is the challenge that we want to settle on when we set the title of Making Liberalism, or Making Liberal Internationalism Great Again. It is not simply about going back, but it's about reflecting. It's about thinking. It's about thinking, is there something new? Is there something we want to give up on? How can we move forward? So a lot of what we've been talking about over the last 2 days has been, what does liberal internationalism mean? Does it mean the same today as it meant in the past? Has liberalism itself changed, and has it changed in such a way that perhaps it has expanded too far and been part of its own demise, or even partly responsible for its own weakening. And if that is the case, what kind of liberalism, what kind of international liberalism is it that we want to rescue? We also had some discussions of to what extent does it matter if some of the middle powers and the small states or the traditional defenders, or at least those that we think are the traditional defenders of liberalism and international liberalism, does it matter if they are changing? Is the liberal international order perhaps not made entirely in the West and by the West and by northern actors? Is it also very much made by southern actors and maybe even by actors that we don't necessarily immediately recognize as liberal international? Then, seen from that perspective, maybe what we often see as threats are opportunities for reforming, for changing, for reshaping, and for thinking differently about how we can organize the world. Making liberal internationalism great again, then, is an opportunity to reflect critically upon ourselves and the way in which we engage in the world, both as Canadians, as Norwegians, and as Danes, and the rest of us too. We didn't come to any firm conclusions, but we had some very good discussions, and what you're going to hear now is some of the highlights of that. We've selected 3 people from our 2-day workshop. Many of the other participants are in the audience, and I hope they will participate. But the 3 people here are 3 people with a vast experience, both as academics, as scholars who've contributed to debates about international liberalism, about order, such as it is. And they've written both about peacekeeping, about global governance, about development assistance, about a whole set of issues that are relevant to our discussions. But they've also, all 3 of them, been engaged in policy, in the policy world, in policy making as advisors, consultants, and so forth. So they are eminently well suited to introduce and to talk to you about this topic. We have in the middle Louise Rees Andersen, who's a senior researcher at DIS in Copenhagen. Our other guest is Ole Jakob Sanding, who's a research director at NUPI in Oslo. And then Roland Paris from the University of Ottawa, who's well known to 6 audiences from past events. I will stop at this. We're going to go through the presentations. Thank you, Roland. And we will then have a Q&A, and we will go from there into our reception and some remarks, first of all, by Ambassador Orban. But Louisa, please.
Thank you. I will be sitting here. Thank you. Thank you, Rita. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for inviting and organizing all of this. It's been a great workshop, and I have my head full of ideas and thoughts, and I'll try to be somewhat coherent. I can't promise you I will. I have also jet lag flying in here. But first of all, I'm really honored and pleased to be here, both personally as a scholar, but also in a sense on behalf of my country, even though I don't speak here in any official position or anything. I'm actually happy that you consider Denmark part of this exclusive group of middle powers, liberal internationalists. Because to be fair, you could say that Denmark is actually not really a middle power. Denmark is definitely a small state. And we're a small state, or it's a small state that takes pride in punching above its weight, but I'm not quite sure that qualifies as being a middle power. But more importantly, or more sort of problematic, is the fact that Danish foreign policy for the past years, depending on where you put the line, has been characterized by some rather deviant behavior compared to what you normally would expect from a good liberal international country. And the most obvious one is the decision back in 2003 to join the US-led invasion in Iraq. But also in recent years, there's been a lot of focus on the determined and very explicit Danish policies of making Denmark as unattractive as possible for asylum seekers. So this, leaves Denmark somewhat the odd man out in the company of liberal internationalists. It's not a new position. Denmark has always sort of had that, or at least for a long time, been the least, if you look at the Nordic cooperation, Nordic countries, Denmark has been the one least enthusiastic about Nordic cooperation. But also within the European Union, Denmark has from the outset been a foot-dragging member, favoring economic over political integration. And Denmark has a number of opt-outs in key areas in European cooperation, including the euro, defense, and justice and home affairs. So against this background, you could ask whether Denmark is in fact a liberal internationalist country. And I would argue that it is, or at least that the Danish foreign policy establishment is hardwired to promote liberal internationalism. But also, more importantly for the topic of today, that they're increasingly realizing that in order at the current moment, they need to seriously rethink the Danish foreign policy decisions in a number of areas, and that's what makes the title relevant, or the question whether Denmark could contribute to making liberal internationalism great again. So the outcome of this rethink is, that remains to be seen. It's ongoing, but some contours are visible, and I will sketch them out, and then I will use them, or the case of Denmark, as the backdrop for pointing out some key elements that I think we all need to grapple with, not just in Denmark, but in the wider discussion on how to make liberal internationalism great again. So first, a few things about liberal internationalism the Danish way. There are sort of two interlinked dogmas that inform Danish foreign policy. The one is that Denmark has an enlightened self-interest in the rule-based international orders. And the other is that Denmark should help carry the burden of maintaining that order and being a responsible member of international society. That's very sort of prominent in Danish self-identity, that we are a responsible member of international society. And this underlines that to Denmark, the support for multilateralism and international cooperation has always been interest-based. It's seen as a way of keeping Denmark safe, but also a way of keeping Denmark rich, because Denmark is a trading nation, and so having a rule-based order is a very fundamental interest. And this also means, compared to some of our Nordic fellows, that Denmark has never projected itself as a moral superpower or pretended that it was out there just to do good. It was always doing good in order to help itself. And this, I think, shapes the way Denmark is currently thinking of returning more to a liberal internationalist base. And then, just to understand this rethink that's ongoing, I think it's important to understand the period that was before 2016 and the period after. So before 2016, Danish foreign policy was adapting to what could be seen as sort of the closing of the unipolar moment. It was fairly clear to Danish foreign policy makers that the finance crisis, the Americans leading from behind, China rising, Russia becoming more assertive, it was all prompting Denmark to sort of reconsider the way it was engaging in the outside world, leading it to focus more on internal or problems closer to home. And a lot of effort was placed on sort of discussing how to prioritize and focus Danish efforts. And one of the things that were put out very openly was that we can no longer afford to have a value-based foreign policy. We need an interest-based foreign policy, somehow diverting from the original basic idea that interest and values were so closely entwined that when we were supporting values, it was because it was in our own interest. But this, so the foreign policy debate was changing, and Denmark was no longer spoken of as an international pioneer. But now there was a need to sort of ensure that Denmark didn't over-implement its international obligations. So Denmark was but one of the phrases that policymakers often used was that Denmark cannot save the entire world. So, which is fairly different from having a liberal internationalist outlook. And then Brexit and Trump hasn't changed, or 2016 hasn't changed those sentiments. Danish politicians and the Danish government still maintains that Denmark needs to look out for itself as the world is changing. But the rethink has had a very different outlook after 2016 than it had before. Because suddenly it became clear to foreign policy establishment that the institutional structures, these tectonic plates as they like to call them, upon which Danish foreign policy rests, could no longer be taken for granted. And they would no longer be maintained by themselves or by someone else. And in this sense, Trump and Brexit have in different ways served as a wake-up call to, and that I think this will revitalize this inner core of liberal internationalism that is there in Danish foreign policy. The question obviously is, what does that mean in practice? And this brings me to the sort of first wider question, which we have also been discussing the past few days. So what do we even mean by liberal internationalism? Is it about certain institutions, procedures, and actors? Or does it relate to certain goals and values? And this, I think, is a key point, which is relevant not just to Denmark, but to all of us, that in order to say liberal internationalism, or even make it great again, we need to specify more clearly what exactly it is we wish to say. Our workshop and today's roundtable shows that the debate is taking off. At the same time as we're meeting here in Ottawa, there are two much larger events, but with very similar themes in Europe. One held by the Global Challenges Foundation and the other by the European Council on Foreign Relations. And they're both asking exactly the same kind of questions that we've been sort of struggling with. So there is definitely out in the world a lot of growing energy and enthusiasm for making liberal internationalism great again, but not quite clarity on in what form and in which elements of the liberal order that we should be saving or making great again. So then returning to the case of Denmark, in the Danish debate, the emphasis is on three particular aspects of the liberal order, and one is keeping the Americans in the tent, as the phrase goes in Denmark. That's very, very important, making sure that the Americans, they don't stray too far away, somehow trying to keep them in the liberal tent. We can discuss how realistic that is, but that's a key priority to the Danish government. And the other is keeping the free trade regime alive. That's very important to the Danish government as well. And then the third one is moving closer to the European core. And this is, in a sense, specific to Denmark, which, as I opened up by saying, has been sort of the odd man out together with the British. And now Denmark fears being sidelined after Brexit, as the French-German integration engine is sort of gearing up in precisely these areas where Denmark is not part of the European cooperation. But this Danish emphasis on Europe or the EU, it actually, as I see it, coincides with much of debate on liberal internationalism and the future of liberal internationalism. There is, I think, a strong tendency to place all liberal hopes, or most of them, on Europe as such, or perhaps on individuals, as Merkel at one point and now Macron. And this, I will argue, is not always helpful in terms of making liberal internationalism great again for the current age. I think liberal internationalism cannot be made great again if we only look to sort of the usual suspects of like-minded good states such as Denmark, Norway, or Canada, or the EU. There is a tremendous need to engage other middle powers and good international citizens as we move forward. And in doing so, I think this requires a willingness to compromise, or maybe a better word is to remain open to alternative ideas of what liberal internationalism may mean, what multilateralism and a rule-based order should look like in the 21st century. And this leads me straight on to my final point, which is in a sense very banal, but I still think it needs to be said, that the crisis of liberal order did not begin in 2016 with Brexit and Trump. Trump and Brexit highlighted it and have in many ways, as I explained about the Danish case, served as a wake-up call to liberal internationalists around the world. But there are in different ways also symptoms of a crisis that runs much deeper. And if we fail to understand that, I think any attempt at making liberal internationalism great again is also bound to fail. We can talk about what brought about that deeper crisis, and I would argue that it's a structural crisis that has to do with the ways in which globalization has both increased the number and diversity of voices that have to be heard and have to agree on global issues, and it has also generated harder and more complex problems. So liberal internationalism of tomorrow will, by definition, look different from the liberal internationalism of the past. But maybe that's a good thing. Because maybe the liberal internationalism of the past didn't only do good stuff. It also produced severe problems such as extreme inequality and climate change. And if we cannot address those problems as we move forward in making liberal internationalism great again, I'm not quite sure how to end here, because it can sound very pessimistic and dark, but just I think we need to make sure that the liberal internationalism of tomorrow has a much broader outlook than the liberal internationalism of yesterday. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, it was a real pleasure for me to participate in this session. Can you tighten this up for me? There, that's good. We're good. And to exchange ideas with excellent scholars and colleagues from the University of Ottawa, other parts of Canada, and from Denmark and Norway. And as you can imagine, and I'm not even going to try to encapsulate the discussion for you. I'm not even going to speak about the Canadian view. I'm just going to give you my own take on the subject of this session. But as you can imagine, our discussion, which was extremely interesting, and you get 15 professors in a room, and you're going to have at least 15 points of view. So I do think, though, that of course, not surprisingly, the tenor of the discussion was one of concern about rising liberalism and challenges to the rules-based international order. And much of the discussion was about what countries that are not major powers, but that have some resources and at least some influence can do about it. So I'd like to do three things in my opening remarks. First, I'd like to briefly talk about the nature of the challenges I see it. Secondly, briefly say why it matters for Canada. That might be self-evident, but I think we have to remind ourselves, and there is some distinctive features of Canada's location and history that make it relevant. And finally, I'll conclude with some thoughts about what Canada and potentially other like-minded countries, be they middle, small, or big, can do about it. So first, on the nature of the problem itself. If we talk about the liberal international order as a set of institutions and rules that support a broadly open international system and that are based in principles of individual freedom, then that order is being challenged in many ways. In some ways that are not really that new, and other ways that are more new and surprising. And it's the way that all these elements come together that make this a particularly sobering moment for liberal internationalism. Now, the familiar, in many ways familiar challenge is competition from Russia and China. I mean, it's taken new forms, but we do need to remind ourselves that we've lived through a period now of unipolarity in the years after the Cold War that was historically anomalous and was bound to give way to something else eventually, and it's in the process of doing that. I'd say Russia and China right now are not seeking to overthrow the liberal international order, but they are actively seeking to undermine some elements of it. The idea of universal human rights, the open exchange of information, the international standing of liberal democracy itself. They're also seeking to carve out their own spheres of influence, creating parallel institutions, and in the Russian case in particular, trying to create divisions within and between Western societies. So that's a serious set of challenges, but it's familiar in the sense that we've faced illiberal challengers before, and indeed Russia and China themselves in the past were more ideologically hostile to liberal democracy than they are now.
They were revolutionary powers, and now they are revisionist powers. That doesn't diminish the seriousness of the challenge, but let's keep that in mind. I think, though, what makes the current challenge all the more dangerous, and maybe even more likely to succeed this time, is the other trend and the other challenge, which is more novel, and that's the rise of illiberalism and anti-internationalist sentiments within what has been the Western core of the system. And that's truly remarkable. Now, right off the bat, let me just put my own biases on the table. I do acknowledge that the liberal international order was never entirely liberal, nor was it ever fully ordered, and depending on where you sit, it could have looked like much more like a kind of imperial system. My bias is that it's the worst type of international order except for all the others, and that despite its many flaws, it underpinned a period of relative peace and prosperity for people in many parts of the world that's really unprecedented in human history. But that argument has been losing purchase internationally, and it's been losing purchase in the West. In my view, there are many different challenges coming together, but the Trump presidency is the biggest threat to the liberal international order since World War II. Obviously, because the United States is the foundation of that order. As Louise suggested, though, Trump himself is a symptom of deeper trends that have been coming together in a kind of perfect storm. The distrust of so-called elites and declining trust in all kinds of institutions, including government. The stagnation in wage growth for large parts of the population in many Western countries, including, this reveals itself in surveys where, for example, Americans are asked whether they feel that they're members of the lower class, middle class, upper middle class, and the percentage saying that they feel that they're members of the lower class has gone up dramatically. A range of disruptive technologies which is fueling all of these processes, eliminating job categories, and empowering fringe actors who would never have had the possibility of broadcasting their messages to the extent that they can now and connecting with others, while also creating vulnerabilities within our societies that our adversaries have been very skilled at exploiting. A nativist reaction to immigration spurred by a surge of migration, which has contributed to this economic and cultural insecurity and to the rise of a return of essentialist kinds of nationalism. The discrediting effects of the Iraq War and America's war on terror on the reputation of liberal democracy itself. The anemic economic performance of Western countries since the financial crisis in comparison to many emerging countries. And the creeping spread of so-called illiberal democracy or elected authoritarianism, not just in places like Thailand or Venezuela, but in members of NATO and the EU, most notably Poland and Hungary, countries that we thought were consolidated democracies. All of these problems are problems within the liberal democratic world. So this is as much a crisis of Western liberalism as it is of liberal internationalism. They can't really be separated. And as we all know, the target of much populist frustration is the liberal international order itself, which is portrayed as a cabal of faceless bureaucrats and rootless cosmopolitans who are seeking to undermine national sovereignty and national identity and sap the national spirit. I keep thinking about that general in Dr. Strangelove, talking about polluting precious bodily fluids. Of course this matters. It matters to Canada even if we've been spared some of these effects, or maybe precisely because we've been spared some of these effects. We're not immune to these kinds of pressures that we've seen elsewhere. There's nothing, angelic about Canadians when they're born. They're subject to culture and political culture and institutional practices. And for us, I think in Canada, part of struggling to maintain the liberal world order is actually reaffirming the kind of values that stand between us and this kind of divisiveness within our own society. Which leads me to the second point I wanted to talk about very briefly about why this matters for Canada. Sometimes, as Rita hinted at, people portray in the Canadian discussion liberal internationalism as naive or nostalgic, and like the kiss of death is to be called Pearsonian or something, but it's a straw man. And because it can be naive and nostalgic, but fundamentally it's about our core interests, and it always has been. We need an international trading system which is open and rule-governed. We are a relatively small economy that is unusually dependent on international trade. If the world veers towards mercantilism, Canada suffers. And if the United States does, it's a matter of our vital national interests. Now, we're not there yet, and I'm not expecting there to be a major rupture in our bilateral relations with the US, but anyone who predicts President Trump's behavior is just guessing, all right? And because he doesn't even know what he's going to do. More generally, we need an international system based on rules and institutions to provide Canada with voice and influence that we would never otherwise have. And that's been a core tenet of our commitment to liberal internationalism from the very start. But it's this mixture of interests, and it's not just about core interests, but there are core interests there. That's the point I want to make. And it also has to do with our own society, as I mentioned a moment ago. The idea of resolving differences among different societies, different peoples, through institutionalized cooperation in the world is the external projection of our own domestic political norms, such that a world of nativism is one that potentially threatens the unity of the Canadian state. So this cuts close to the bone. So I've said a bit about what the challenge is and why it matters to Canada. Let me conclude with a few thoughts on what Canada can do. So 3 things, and none of them are earth-shattering. First is that we need to actively reinforce the existing multilateral arrangements, not in spite of the US, but in order to keep them going until such time as the US rediscovers its interest in being actively engaged. And I think we'll see the United States veer back towards that kind of position eventually. Why? Because it is in its long-term core national interests, and countries ultimately revert to their core national interests. That's my presumption. So how do you do that? Maintaining the existing structures. That's a big statement, but let me give you a couple of examples. Paris, I won't use that as an example. Kellogg Brion Pact was not one that I can hang up, wave around. Paris Climate Accord. So, obviously the planned withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Climate Accord is very damaging. But that didn't mean everybody turned around and said, okay, I guess we're done. It's all over. Might as well just forget about this. No, there has been renewed action in this area, including outreach directly to subnational actors in the United States. California and a number of mid-Atlantic states have their own price on carbon, cities, and private actors as well. Canada hosted a meeting, a post-Paris implementation meeting, bringing China and the European Union here to Canada to continue an ongoing discussion about implementation of the Paris Accord. Can it survive without the US government? Well, but I don't know. But by continuing to breathe life into it, there is a seat at the table which is being kept warm, in effect, for the US federal government. You could say the same thing about the TPP. The TPP wasn't abandoned. It was slightly renegotiated, turned into the comprehensive and progressive, I can't even remember anymore, CPTPP. And there is a docking station for the United States in that agreement. So there was no giving up on the idea of the TPP, which is about much more than trade. It's also about norms for the region. And also preventing the rupture of existing organizations. We're going to see that, the big Prime Minister Trudeau's arguably biggest challenge in next month at Charlevoix, Quebec, when he hosts the G7 meeting, is to prevent the G7 from becoming the G6 plus Donald Trump. And that is a risk at every major international summit meeting, and so far those situations to varying degrees of success, have been managed. But keeping the integrity of this G7 entity, and of course NATO. And I think that ultimately, when the history is told that the first NATO meeting that Donald Trump attended, that there will be a story about Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau being part of keeping that meeting from going off the rails. And you could say the same thing about the WTO. The fact is, the United States is now going to take BC to court, Canada to court, because of BC wines and protectionists. They're protectionists, you know, okay, so I can say it, I'm not in government. But it's strangely encouraging to have the United States sue Canada in the WTO, because that's the structure that you want to pursue. Secondly, Canada can, and other states can, really renew efforts to assemble coalitions of public and private actors to tackle specific problems and issues. So there's a diffusion of power. That's part of the challenges we're facing, but it also creates much more fluidity and possibility for new collections of actors, private or public. And this is an area, I think, of some hope. And I think, you know, Rita was hinting at that in her opening remarks as well. We can talk more about that. I'm out of time, so let me just say the third is to be dealing with the domestic side of this crisis of liberalism, taking those anxieties seriously and sharing the benefits of trade in order to underscore that trade is not simply serving the benefits of the elite, acknowledging and maybe addressing and giving greater national control in some areas that has been lost through to globalization. Anyway, I'll conclude by saying that it's sobering, but certainly not desperate situation. Desperation, even if it were warranted desperation, you still shouldn't be desperate, because that's immobilizing. And the world is of our own creation, so we need to be agents. But I don't think the situation is desperate. I think that there's always possibility for renewal. The people are not going to rush to the streets around the world demanding the Chinese system of government, but they may demand their freedom. Thanks.
So it's great to be here. A lot of what is on my mind has been said already. So what I will try to do is to focus more specifically on one subset of the issues that both Louise and Roland have touched upon. And it concerns both so it's not the crisis within liberal democratic countries, but the crisis within the international institutions that are supposed to be the bearers of the multilateral or rules-based order that small and middle powers are dependent upon. So, what I think is important to recognize is that when we talk, and we have spent a lot of time, and Rita alluded to this during the last 2 days, talking about, well, what is the crisis in question? So, I think it's important to distinguish between liberalism in terms of a crisis of liberal values within particular countries on the one hand, and a crisis of liberal internationalism or a liberal world order on the other. Those are distinct things. So now we're seeing a bit of both. I will focus mostly on the order aspect in terms of the relations between states. Obviously these are related, but still. So Norway as a small, I don't think we should say middle power. I think to be not, yeah, I think Norway is a small.
Being too modest.
Yeah, okay. But for small and middle powers, of course, investing in international organizations have been important, but there has been a tendency to assume that all good things come together and overlooking the tensions between different types of motivations for investing in international organizations. So, for a country like Norway and many others, investing in international organizations have advanced or been reflective of a certain type of moral values. So development aid, humanitarian aid, support for human rights work. It has been used also in terms of, well, in doing this, we're also helping our important ally, the US, in securing its interests. There's also been an administrative justification in terms of aid budget going up, but a cap on staff in the foreign ministry. And so one solution to that is to channel more funding through international organizations. But the most important one, of course, is that investments in international organizations supports and advances a rules-based order. Now, in the Norwegian context, when you say a rules-based order, that is basically that small states are dependent on rules so that the powerful states cannot do what they want to do, but have to abide by the same rules. So it's not necessarily a set of liberal rules in the sense of a certain political liberalism, if you like. It's rules. It's a rules-based order. Now, a number of interesting developments have occurred that challenges the relationship between international organizations on the one hand and the strengthening of this rules-based order. So, with the establishment of the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions, there was, of course, a tension between different ideas about what type of order would these organizations support and advance. Over time, however, and despite the fact that Russia and China had veto powers in the UN Security Council, etc., over time, the UN and the IMF and the World Bank, broadly speaking, advanced an agenda much more supported by the US and its Western allies than other types of markets. So what happened was basically that these international organizations, as public organizations, were to a large extent also tools for the advancement and institutionalization of an order that favored some interests more than others. So national interests of some states were institutionalized through rules supported by some international organizations. Now, for small states like Norway, investing in international organizations in this setup makes a lot of sense, because you invest in international organizations that advances your interest and at the same time supports and institutionalizes a rules-based order, which is the most important thing. Now, what has happened over the last couple of decades, and even more pronounced in the last decade or so, are two things. One is internal to Western states and driven by Western states. Another trend, as others have mentioned, is pushed by, say, Russia and China. Both of these developments undermines the publicness of international organizations and weakens the rules-based order. Now, let me just go through that. The trends in international organizations have been that they have gone from being based on core funding, predetermined by a key depending on the size of the country in question, to voluntary and earmarked funding. So this was very much advanced by Western states. They wanted international organizations to do more with less. But when you base your operations on voluntary funding, and particularly earmarked funding, these international organizations are less public than we would like to think. Because then some states can say, do this, do not do that. We give you funding to do this, and this in particular, not that. Now then, they become very explicitly tools for some states to advance their interests. There's another development as well, which has increased the scope and efficacy, I think, of international organizations, and that is the way in which they have teamed up with the private sector and work with NGOs to do good stuff. But that also has significant implications for what these organizations are, if we consider them first and foremost as important in advancing rules that all states need to abide by. Now, in parallel to this development, of course, there is the emergence of what Alex Cooley calls a new playbook on the part of Russia and China in particular, that seeks to muddy the waters and to hollow out certain rules and norms that are considered important. So, advancing the concept of traditional values in human rights work, advancing the concept of civilizational diversity through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Taken together, the relative privatization, I would say, of public international organizations on the one hand, and the attempts to water down some key aspects of what these organizations are doing and trying to develop basically counter norms to establish human rights norms, render international organizations in a much more precarious position and not necessarily as bearers and guarantors of a rules-based order. So what we have instead is basically an arena where there is much more competition of what the rules are. This is important because, to give you one example, the debate in the UN Security Council over how to investigate the chemical weapons attack in Douma in Syria. The US proposed one resolution saying an investigating team should go, collect all the facts, and make a judgment and finding on who they think did it. That did not receive enough votes, as we know. The Russian proposal said a team should go, identify the facts, but it should be left up to the UN Security Council to determine who perpetrated the attacks. Now, I mention this because international organizations are a collection of rules. Small middle powers are dependent on these rules. Now, what's happening in this context is that there are certain rules. So, for example, we have a rule that when stuff like this happens, we send a team to investigate what happened. But if there is not agreement on the higher order rules for how this is going to take place, then we have trouble. So it's the hierarchy of rules within these international organizations that are being challenged. This is compounded by another trend, which is a turn from hard law to soft law. So there is a much more stronger tendency to rely on soft law mechanisms, voluntary conformity and peer pressure, as opposed to hard law and obligations in international organizations, which means that there is a huge expansion on doing the more easy stuff and very little political energy being devoted to how do we figure out dealing with the hard stuff, the hard cases. And I think this is the case in Norwegian foreign policy. Now, this means that the whole infrastructure for expanding liberal internationalism has arguably, the infrastructure for doing it has expanded, but it has come at the cost at the cost of weakening the rules in questions. And this, of course, is also, it has to be understood in the context of the development of counter norms and strategies from non-Western authoritarian regimes. But if I look then to Norway and what could be done about this, there is now a tendency to, or an inability to de-link the importance of establishing and advancing a rules-based order and the ongoing debates about how to deal with, say, Russia. So, just one example. The framework of the OSCE is such that it allows member states to sit down and talk, and it has three pillars. It's the political and military, it's human rights, and economic and environmental issues. because of the difficult relationship between Europe and Russia, there has been very little work being done, basically. The third pillar, economic environmental, has been marginalized. They don't use it. It should be used to try to foster more cooperation, and we know this from the Cold War, that investing in cooperation where there is less political sensitivities involved is important. Also, when you have the interest of advancing liberal values, because you need trust to cooperate with other actors. So, my argument vis-a-vis international organizations could be interpreted as one of going back to how it was in the past, with public international organizations, no private funding, core contributions, more autonomy for UN agencies, etc. That's not going to happen, of course. So it's more a question of how to navigate in this new landscape. Because I think in many foreign ministries, there is a tendency to continue to invest in the organization that they have always invested in without asking the question, do this investment in these international organizations advance the core interest of furthering a rules-based order or not? And trying to think through new strategies for maybe engaging other actors through this infrastructure, both public and private actors, is something that needs to be considered. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I think they deserve a round of applause. Thank you. So, we have some time, about 30 minutes or so, for questions and answers. What we normally do, there's a lot to think about here. There are many people, I'm sure, who would like to say something. So can I ask people two things? Introduce themselves when they ask a question or make a comment. And please refrain from giving us a very long lecture. I'm sure you have a lot to say, but trying to think of a way of putting it succinctly. So I will open the floor and then do you want to use it? I assume everyone can hear me from up here without the microphone, but we will pass the microphone around. Stephanie will come around. So any questions or comments to start us off? Oh, that's very unusual. Right, so the hot weather that got to you. This Alexandra, and then we have one there, yes? Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the presenters, excellent presentations, and we've been talking about these issues for a couple of days, so I'm just continuing this conversation. But a couple of quick questions to such all of you, please. If you look at the priorities for Denmark, apparently there are some tensions there, keeping the US independent, but also from the point of view of Denmark becoming, more of a core European state. Now, in light of what's happening in Washington, that's not going to be easy. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about this tension and how Denmark might try to navigate this. Roland, not surprisingly, I completely agree. I think these are excellent points. On the question, and just one specific question, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the immediate challenge, G7, and the importance of trying to protect its integrity. How do we do that? How does the Canadian government do that? Not least because, as you said, no one quite knows what Trump is going to do, not even Trump. And who might be the allies? Because I think you're absolutely right in the case of NATO trying to save that the meeting that you mentioned. It was crucial for Trudeau that he had allies, and in that case it was Angela Merkel. In this instance, who might be the allies? And I'm thinking both public governments, but also potentially private. I'm thinking possible networks with the US actors. I would be grateful for your thoughts on this. And Ole Jakob, again, I really do, I think it's a really important point. You're absolutely right, you can't go back. So how do we go forward? I'm wondering if I could invite you to say a little bit more about how this public-private partnership might be articulated, what you perhaps regard as some of the red lines in defining this partnership, and what might be some of the more promising avenues that you see in the future. Thank you so much once again to all of you.
There was somebody signaled that you're a person in the white shirt.
Hi, my name is Sven Sherman. I'm from Policy Horizons Canada. Thank you so much for that presentation. My question is kind of along the same lines. It's along, when we have these unsurmountable or seemingly unsurmountable differences that nation states have, especially when it comes to global governance, could you see a way in which we have a rise of, I'm going to call them ad hoc and issue-specific coalitions? So when we have gridlock, some countries just get together with private and public actors and say, let's just get together, fix this, and then when the problem's done, we're going to turn to other problems with completely different actors in the mix.
Well, you have quite a lot to chew on, so I think I'll stop with those two questions, or those two set of questions now, and then we'll take the next round. So let's go in the reverse order. So, Jakob, would you like to start?
No, I don't, because I don't have it.
No. You see, there's a saying that in being an academic and trying to organize it is like herding cats. So this is what I've been up against for the last 2 days. Who would like to start?
No, it's fine. To Alexandra, I don't know whether it's possible to say in general what would be red lines. I think my point is that at least what one should do is to sit down and think through what types of issues with what types of actors, both public and private, can be mobilized together to try to further better understanding and trust between some of the key actors that are important in general. Now, of course, it's really, really hard. I mean, normatively speaking, there are certain red lines. For a politician, of course, this is much, much harder to do, right? And I recognize the difficulty of doing it. But at least trying to think through some of these issues and trying to develop a strategy rather than going on and on and on about the problems of the behavior of particular states, such as Russia, and without trying to develop new innovative strategies, I think is a bit problematic. So that's my point, I guess, to try to encourage that. I'm not sure if I understood your question. Is the question about whether it's a good idea to do ad hoc coalitions depending on issue areas?
Well, could you see those arising?
I think they're already there. I mean, global governance today is such that on some issue areas it's dominated by states. On other issue areas it's completely dominated by firms and NGOs. In some issue areas, some international organizations are important, on others they're not. And you see, I think my point here would be that in order for smaller middle powers to further a rules-based order, they would have to learn to navigate these networks that are very distinct in different issue areas. So Norway and Canada are the best in the world of navigating and mobilizing these networks when it comes to humanitarian advocacy, for example. So they know the strategy that you could use, but that type of strategy could also be used on other issue areas.
So very quickly, Alexandra, the answer to your question, how do you deal with these areas? The answer is very carefully. It's really what diplomacy is all about. And so there'll be officials who have been meeting for months and months and months working through a text. And if there are parts of the text that are still unresolved, then that could end up being negotiated at the last minute, usually not negotiated directly by the leaders themselves, but maybe during the summit. And there are hot button issues, obviously, trade with the steel sanctions. Most recently, climate change is an ongoing challenge, point of difference, and of course the Iran
situations now added to that list of hot button issues. But there is an endless list of issues that, you know, all 7 countries and, you know, the EU can be agreeing on. You know, everything from money laundering to ocean health to women's rights and empowerment. And the real question is going to be whether you can fudge the areas where there is some disagreement, or whether Trump, when he gets to the summit and actually turns his attention to this, will insist on the United States basically having like a what's the word in judicial judgment, a dissent, right? If they have a dissenting element, then that reinforces the division, and that is not the message that you want to send. So, and then I just echo what Jakob said about these issue-specific coalitions. They already exist. This is really a growing part of global governance. The risk is that they reinforce regional separations and blocks. They don't have to if there is a conscious effort to be building kind of diverse groupings together, private-public actors.
Thank you. And Alexandra, you're absolutely right in pointing to the tension, and it's there. It's not the only tension that's there. There's also the question of how do we relate to China, which is currently seen primarily as, you know, a land of opportunities, and there's a lot going for having very close. Denmark takes much pride in having a strategic partnership as the only Nordic country with China, but increasingly this, okay, so maybe China isn't just about opportunities, maybe there are some dangers, and how do we navigate those? But I think that the main, it goes to Denmark being a small state, is keeping our heads down, you know, not being very vocal about these tensions and not sort of addressing them in the open. But specifically in relation to America, one of the things that the Danish government is trying to do, and actually has been quite open about, is connecting to sub-state actors, or to federal, to state actors, not the federal government only, and to Congress also. So trying to sort of get, not just work with Trump administration, but with people outside that, and I think that's part of the effort to keep the U.S. in the tent, sort of keeping relations alive with those parts of American society that have a different worldview than the Trump administration. And then maybe just to add one thing to the question on ad hoc and issue-specific coalitions, I'm completely agreeing with what Roland and Ole Jakob said, but I think we also have to realize that one of the dangers in that rising sort of approach to global governance is that it leaves a lot of questions unaddressed, and so there are clear gaps in global governance. There's a lot of global governance out there. There's a lot of institutions and structures and rules and regulations and ways of working together, but also issues that are not being addressed and that cannot be captured by these ad hoc and issue-specific coalitions, because they simply demand a much higher level of political engagement and much more sort of firm engagement from national leaders, not just public-private partnerships, stuff like that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a growing list of questions. I'm taking them in the order that I see people, which I think is fair. So John here, Stephanie. Second row. Sorry, I have to voice my apologies.
John Thomas from Global Affairs Canada in the Research and Foresight Unit. I should say my personal comments. Just very quick two-pronged questions. One is regarding the actual term middle power, and whether, I'm curious whether in your today workshop, whether you explored the concept of emerging middle powers, which do not necessarily subscribe to the same principles that are perhaps assumed when we talk about partners like Norway, Canada, and Denmark. And more specifically, I'm thinking about South Africa, but others as well, Indonesia, etc., etc. The other one, again, related, is this talk of a rules-based international order. Minister Freeland, for example, spoke in Parliament last year about defending the order, but also making some, quote, adjustments. What do these adjustments mean? I know all of you referred briefly to some of this, But you know, we're also trying to explore what adjustment means. For instance, is the G7 an institution that its time has come? Just again, for polemic purposes and personal purposes.
Stephanie, right at the back, Michael.
Hi, Michael Williams from the University of Ottawa. Thanks, everybody. That was great. Since we have somebody from the forecasting unit from the government, I'm going to ask you to engage in some very unfairly some disaster kind of stuff, especially since we have 2 Europeans right now. Let's take contemporary events and extrapolate them out just slightly. If we assume that the European order, especially the West European or EU order, has always been central to the liberal order, let's assume that tensions between its Eastern members and its Western core members continue to escalate. Hungary, Poland, potentially Slovakia, a variety of other countries. Let's also take the events of the last 36 hours and say that the currency crisis in some of the southern members intensifies. Italy crashes out of the euro, Greece potentially follows, etc., etc. What does that do, A, to the liberal world order in your view, and what does that do to the world order in your view? They're really unfair questions, but I really
Stephanie, JS. No, okay, we'll do that.
Thank you. My name is Mark Farron. I'm a specialist in demographics of international health, interested in these topics generally. I said 2 kind of comments and reactions. It's sort of the, is it the morphology or the international architecture? I find that the whole conversation is excessively Eurocentric, assuming that liberalism is only in Europe and in North America. I'm very concerned, although I was happy to hear the reference to China, because people referred several times to Russia and China, Russia and China. Well, that's like a mantra. And Russia and China are very different. I mean, China is very different than Russia. China, I think, has been holding up the international economy for about 20 years. And people will say, well, only growing by 7% this year. And like, they're not carrying their load. So they've been driving, I find, the international liberalism without China the last 25 years. We wouldn't even be talking about this. Capitalism would be dead. And the other point is, why is no one talking about how do you cultivate the idea of becoming an honest broker? Because to become influential, you have to be a good and honest broker. I think we were a better broker 25 years ago in Canada's situation. I don't think we were a very good broker in the last 10 years. So I think that's something to work on.
I think we'll take brief responses here, and then I'll take a final round of questions. So, relatively brief, even if they're big issues.
Well, then I'll dodge Mike's question entirely because there are 2 Europeans here, so there you go. And maybe the first, John's question and the last question are somewhat connected because it's about, adjusting the world order and the role of, rising powers in Russia and China, etc. There is literally no way to answer this question in 30 seconds other than to say that we face and by we I mean the big we, the world, faces a generational challenge here of managing power shift that is taking place with unprecedented speed in history, and to manage that transition in a way that doesn't produce what many previous power transitions have produced, which is instability and even systemic war. And so, with that said, I'll just stop. No. Again, this is a huge question, but I think there's 2 elements here. And reconciling both of them is difficult. First is that what I call the kind of Western core of the liberal international system, that was a Western core of the liberal. I mean, it was the United States founded system. And if you want to take a more critical view of it, you could say it was an imperial system, everybody else were imperial auxiliaries. It's not the view that I take, but I recognize it. So the first element is that we need to get our
confidence back. And that is an internal challenge. It's a challenge for our politics, and it's also a challenge in terms of our policy across a range of areas. And I'm not sure if we can do that in the current political environment, but things change, governments change, this too shall pass. So strengthening the court at the same time as being willing to give up some of the power of the court. And that means increasing opportunities for emerging powers to have the voice that they've been requesting. And I think that another element of this is restoring the kinds of communication that we had with Russia during the Cold War, which have gone away paradoxically. And having lots of connective tissue. Because a country like China, this is a challenge not just for the big we, but also it's a bilateral challenge. In our relations with China, we have never had to really, in our history, manage a relationship with a big, important country, which is simultaneously a partner and an adversary. We've had adversaries, we've had partners, we've never done both, and we're not even close to getting our brains around that.
Yes, thank you. That's, easy questions, and then 30 seconds to reply, so it shouldn't be a problem. Mike, what does it do? It tears it all apart. That's what it does. If the tensions between the North and South and the East and West continues, and then there is no European project, there is no European liberal order, and I think that would be detrimental to also bigger sort of questions of world order. In my presentation, I said we shouldn't put all our faith in Europe, but we should put a lot of faith in Europe, I would say, coming from Europe. But it also goes to this, the adjustments to order, and just to echo what Roland said about this, making space for other non-Western actors is very key, and also recognizing that they have already played a tremendous role. Like you said, you can debate, the role of China and the way it has done it and the way it seeks to project its global powers, but I think we have to recognize that, there are other powers, and the West isn't what it used to be, and it has to make way for others, and it has to make way for others in a way that doesn't create a war, as she said. And I think that is the big challenge. I think part of the difficulty is realizing, and this probably is because I have a background in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that this demands a tremendous investment in diplomacy. And actually getting these relations back together and speaking to people which we don't see eye to eye to, and all of these old-fashioned, diplomatic ways of dealing with each other. And I think that's something we still need to. There's a lot of focus on, what can the market do? What can we achieve from technological innovations? And sort of hoping that somehow these forces out there will help us solve the problem. But I think we need just good old state power and diplomacy to somehow be revitalized also in what you refer to as the core.
Okay, I'll start with the hard one first, which is Mike's question on the EU. So the paradox here is that one would probably need more international cooperation to address the effects of globalization that to some extent is behind the problems. But more international cooperation is precisely what these countries are against, at least some of them, right? So there's a huge, and that tells us a lot about the configuration of the resources in terms of global governance, I think. That there is so much attention to some issues and very little to the others that we see now popping up in different countries. So if it happens, it's back to the drawing table. And I think we will see, of course, a very, very different Europe. But in the long term, it may also loosen up on some of the rules that are today very problematic to deal with in terms of financial regulations and monetary policy, etc., etc. On China and Russia, you're quite right that it's a shorthand, and we shouldn't do that. And you're right, there's a huge difference between China and Russia, I think. China has been increasing its investment in UN peace operations, investing in more in international organizations now, increasing its voting shares at the World Bank now recently. At the same time, it does play a slightly different game, and we shouldn't be surprised. So it sought a few months ago to push through a resolution at the EU Human Rights Council that basically shifted the reference from individuals to states. So you have to read the text very carefully to pick up on that. That was actually what was going on. But there is this tactic of trying to develop these counter norms to change the discourse a little bit. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to take the final round of questions and hand it back to you for even briefer responses. I'm a hard master today. Stephanie, Jean-François first here, please.
Hi, so I'm Jean-François Bonnet from Queen Mary University, London, UK. Guys, thank you so much. I admire the energy you still have to be talking to us today. This is another easy question. Ron, you highlighted very clearly that one of the problems of that crisis now has to do with lack of trust, technocracy, quite profound in ways that it's always been there. I think now we've seen Brexit and Trump and so on, but it's something else. So how do you make liberal internationalism great again? Or given that liberal governance is by nature technocratic, that liberal internationalism has always been an elitist project, elite-driven project. So what do you do here? How do you address this? Right? Do you turn to referendum like David Cameron, who's with that took us, right?
No.
Right. So what sort of tools have you got here to try to revamp the project? Sorry.
So the young gentleman on there, yes. I'm allowed to call people young still, aren't I? Thank you.
Hi guys, my name is Ben, and I just came here for work actually. And my question is pretty basic and philosophical, which is, how do we define what is the liberal international order? Because it seems to me like fundamentally the philosophical crisis is that we can't agree on what is liberal and what is not liberal.
You should have been at our workshop. I'm going to take the final question right next to him, Stephanie. And that will be the final one.
I'll be very fast. Tim Shaw, adjunct here in Carleton, and I've just been teaching global governance at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Before we get too depressed, what about emerging middle powers like Korea and the Gulf? And secondly, this is pre-Mark Zuckerberg, I guess, what about links, networks such as FANG, and even resurrecting that old thing that Canada was central to in the G20? Thank you.
Thank you. So you'll get a little bit of time to sum up, pick your responses, and we'll see what happens. Who wants to start? Louisa.
I can start, okay, thank you. Well, I'll try to combine JF's questions and Ben. So I think one of the things we haven't touched upon is this sort of this, liberal, as if everybody knows what it is, but I think we actually need to distinguish between sort of the neoliberal project and the neoliberal approach to global governance and to international cooperation, and then a more classical liberal approach. And I think in terms of, I think from my perspective, the neoliberal part has been much about sort of deregulating and undermining state power, whereas the classical liberal is about regulating, and it's about solving public problems. And I think we need to get back to that more classical liberal approach, which also, I would argue, is perhaps less, it panders less to the interests of the elite than the neoliberal approach, which has created this extreme global inequality that we're also facing. So I think that would be my response to those. And emerging middle powers, I think it's also part of the, yes, there are other good actors out there. It's not entirely up to sort of three of us, of the country that we come from, and I think that's really important to recognize.
Go ahead, because I have no clue.
All right, good. I'll give you a couple minutes to be able to figure out what you want to say. So Jeff, I mean, that's a tough question. How do you deal with this lack of trust? I mean, ultimately, this is the academic in me wants to say, that's not really my area of research. But I think, ultimately, the solution to negative populism is positive populism. What do I mean by that? I mean getting people excited about the values of openness, of tolerance, thinking about an open exchange of ideas, of freedom, as these things that people treasure. I mean, these Western publics, the populist elements of these Western publics that we've seen so far are, in most cases, minority elements, right? Front National vote has gone up, still minority element. Brexit vote, it was a moment, etc., and many other Western countries. I think that there is still you look at American public opinion with regard to internationalism, it's really shockingly consistent with the past. Positive attitudes towards trade, positive attitudes towards NATO, positive attitudes towards other organizations. What I see there is raw material to be activated. So in some ways, this is a political challenge for people to be able to stand up and articulate in a way that draws out the best in what people have within them. So I know that's a bit of a pat answer, but we've seen that happen. Macron as the kind of outsider-insider candidate. Here in Canada, Justin Trudeau. I mean, it's a positive populism. When he talks about diversity as a strength, you might get bored with that, but what he's doing is reinforcing a norm and reiterating the way in which Canadians do think about themselves, and many Canadians also have darker thoughts. So which are you going to draw out? That's the talent of the politician. But ultimately, it has to be about addressing core anxieties of people as well. It can't just be about selling a product or the quality of the selling of a product. And those anxieties in the West are connected with slow growth and growing polarization of income and wealth. They're also related to cultural anxieties too, right? And so, Merkel has been addressing this in her own way, and somewhat successfully too. So, bottom line is that I remember reading about the late U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and the great thinker and politician, and who in the 1970s was saying, in the immediate aftermath of a democratic reversal in India, was lamenting the passing of liberal democracy, that it was a thing of the past. This has no legs, liberal democracy. And then we had the wave of democratization take us from like 40 democracies to 120. So don't underestimate the power of those feelings of freedom to counter the anxieties at the same time.
Oh yeah. Two things in response to Jeff's question. I think I'm going to sound so social democratic now. Taxation is a very basic thing, which has gone down. Inequality increases. More taxation and getting a handle on tax evasion and all that will actually help, because it will establish public institutions in each country better to deal with problems. That's one. The other is taking what those that thrive on the lack of trust, so for lack of a better term, populists, taking seriously their analysis of what's going on, because that has not sunk in, I think, among many politicians. Taking them seriously, what they're saying, and engaging in a public debate on the facts and on their solutions. Boring, but I think in the end, what has to be done. Stop it. Oh, yeah, sorry. On the G20, the G20 is potentially very, very important in serving as an arena for a different type of coordination between great powers and middle powers. The challenge is how do you ensure the legitimacy of the G20 if that body becomes the de facto decision-making entity. But I actually do think that there are ways in which the G20 can improve relations between great powers and thus also increase the volume functioning of international organizations.
I'm very pleased because I feel we managed to finish on a relatively optimistic tone, which there were times during our workshop when we were very far from optimistic. So I'm very pleased that we managed to finish on that note. I'm also pleased because I think we managed to give you a little bit of a taste of the type of conversations that we've had over the last 2 days. But more than anything we've begun a conversation, we've opened up some questions. We have by no means provided the solutions or the closing final conclusion on this is how we're going to make liberal internationalism great again. What we're saying is there are some really important issues here that we need to have a much deeper, much more engaged and much more thoughtful conversation about. And we would like to think that we've begun that. And then we can meet again for another roundtable and talk about it again. And maybe we will be further along the road. With that, I would like to invite, as I mentioned, we will have a reception hosted by the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Ottawa. So to finish off this great evening, I would like to invite Ambassador Anne-Karin Hoven to say a few words. I don't know if you would like to come here or where you want.
Certainly, your 2 days of workshop must have been so energetic, inspiring, and stimulating. And thank you for giving us a little bit of that atmosphere and energy here this afternoon. And thank you so much, Rita, for inviting me to say a few words in closing. I am really delighted that I have this opportunity to say a few words because this cooperation between these three renowned research institutions in Canada, Denmark and Norway has really come into being. I'm very pleased also to know that you are working on more closer collaboration. That is messages I like to hear. Because speaking from a Norwegian perspective, the close connection between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and institutions such as NUPI is really something that we value highly in the Foreign Service. Because policy needs to be knowledge-based, and ongoing capacity to adjust policy in response to significant global change is of course vital. And so fora like this, bringing together different stakeholders is really in everyone's interest. And expanding connections between Canadian and Norwegian research institutions is not only a key priority for me and the embassy, it is in line with our research strategy for the Norwegian Foreign Service launched last year for 2017 to 2024. And as this discussion has shown, and certainly over the 2 last days, we have a lot to gain in exchanging views and working together. It is clear that the liberal internationalism, as we have known it in the post-war era, is being challenged in many different ways. It is also clear that our 3 countries, Canada, Denmark and Norway, face many of the same dilemmas, having traditionally been major beneficiaries and contributors to the international rule-based order. It is perhaps less clear what we need to do about it, and you have discussed that very thoroughly, I think, over the last 2 days and shared some of your advice already at this roundtable. Norway's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ine Eriksen Søreide, she said in her annual address to the Parliament earlier this spring, a responsible foreign policy means that we need to relate to the world as it is, with all its complexities and dilemmas. Very often the choice is not about which option is the best, but which option is the lesser of the evils. And not making a choice is also a decision that has consequences. And under such circumstances, the Minister reminds us that the work to maintain and strengthen multilateral institutions and the legal order become even more important. And it is incumbent upon us as like-minded states to expand the understanding that international law is in everyone's interest, both smaller and larger countries. The Minister has actually initiated a project that will look at precisely these questions: what Norway's interests are in the multilateral world order and how we best can contribute to setting the agenda. The project will invite a broad range of actors to debate these questions and will culminate in a white paper to Parliament next spring. And I am sure that the insights coming out of this workshop and roundtable will be stimulating input in this process.